People rarely make decisions for the reasons they confidently explain afterward. That's one of the most uncomfortable discoveries in behavioral psychology. Ask someone why they accepted a job, ended a relationship, trusted a stranger, or ignored a warning sign, and they'll usually give you a coherent story. The explanation sounds logical, it sounds complete, but the human mind is an expert at creating narratives after the fact. Much of what drives behavior happens long before conscious reasoning catches up. Emotion moves first. Logic often arrives later to explain the journey. That doesn't mean people are irrational. It means they're human. The brain evolved to make rapid judgments in environments where hesitation could be dangerous. Long before modern society existed, our ancestors benefited from making quick decisions based on incomplete information. Those shortcuts still exist today. The problem is that modern relationships are far more complex than the environments those instincts evolved to navigate. Confidence can be mistaken for competence. Familiarity can be mistaken for trust. Attention can be mistaken for affection. Intensity can be mistaken for compatibility. Each of these mental shortcuts feels convincing in the moment because the brain prefers certainty over ambiguity. One of the strongest forces shaping relationships is reciprocity. When someone consistently invests time, attention, or emotional energy, we naturally feel pulled to respond in kind. It's one of the invisible rules that allows cooperation to exist. But reciprocity isn't guaranteed. Different people perceive investment differently. One person believes frequent communication expresses care. Another experiences the same behavior as pressure. One person values words. Another values reliability. Neither perspective is automatically right or wrong. They're simply operating from different internal maps. Conflict often begins when people assume everyone interprets the world through the same map. They do. They don't. Every person's expectations are shaped by family, culture, experience, personality, and previous relationships. Understanding that doesn't eliminate disappointment. It makes disappointment easier to understand. There's another misconception that quietly damages relationships. Many people believe attraction alone is enough to sustain connection. It isn't. Attraction opens the door. Character determines whether anyone stays. Kindness becomes more valuable than charm. Consistency becomes more valuable than excitement. Trust becomes more valuable than intensity. These qualities rarely create dramatic stories, but they create stable relationships. And stability is often underestimated because it feels ordinary. The brain naturally pays more attention to novelty than consistency. That's why dramatic moments are remembered so vividly. Yet lasting relationships are built far more by ordinary Tuesdays than extraordinary weekends. They're built through repeated demonstrations of reliability, small promises kept, difficult conversations handled with respect, disagreements that strengthen understanding instead of destroying it. The people who appear emotionally secure aren't free from fear or doubt. They've simply learned not to let every emotion become a command. That's an important distinction. Emotions contain information. They don't always contain instructions. Feeling rejected doesn't necessarily mean you were rejected. Feeling certain doesn't necessarily mean you're correct. Feeling anxious doesn't necessarily mean danger is present. Learning to pause between emotion and action is one of the most valuable psychological skills a person can develop. In that pause, better decisions become possible. Not perfect decisions, better ones. And over time, those small improvements compound into a very different life. The longer you observe human behavior, the more you notice a pattern that appears in nearly every relationship, friendship, workplace, and family dynamic. People don't simply respond to reality. They respond to the meaning they assign to reality. Two people can experience the exact same conversation and leave with completely different conclusions. One remembers respect. The other remembers criticism. One sees honesty. The other sees rejection. What changed? Not the event, the interpretation. Our brains are prediction machines. Every experience we have becomes another piece of information used to anticipate what might happen next. If someone has repeatedly encountered betrayal, they may become highly sensitive to signs of inconsistency. If someone has consistently experienced support, they may interpret uncertainty more generously. Neither response appears out of nowhere. They're shaped over time. This doesn't mean people are trapped by their past. It means awareness matters. The moment you begin recognizing your own patterns, you gain the opportunity to question them. Am I reacting to what is happening now? Or am I reacting to something that happened years ago? That question alone can change the direction of an entire conversation, because not every emotional response belongs to the present. Sometimes the present simply activates an old emotional blueprint. The challenge is that those blueprints feel real. They don't announce themselves as memories. They feel like facts. That's why self-awareness is less about becoming someone different and more about learning to recognize when your mind is filling in gaps with assumptions. Assumptions are efficient. They're also dangerous. The brain loves completing incomplete pictures. If someone doesn't reply quickly, one person assumes they're busy. Another assumes they're losing interest. A third assumes they've done something wrong. The same event, 3 different stories. The story influences the emotion. The emotion influences the behavior. The behavior influences the outcome. This cycle repeats countless times throughout life. Breaking it requires something many people avoid: curiosity. Curiosity interrupts certainty. Instead of saying, "I know what they meant," curiosity asks, "What else could explain this?" That simple shift creates room for better judgment. It reduces unnecessary conflict. It lowers defensiveness. And it makes communication far more effective. Another overlooked truth is that consistency quietly shapes trust more than dramatic gestures ever will. Grand promises create emotion. Repeated follow-through creates confidence. Anyone can make an impressive first impression. Maintaining integrity over months and years is something else entirely. That's why mature relationships often look less exciting from the outside. They're not fueled by constant emotional highs. They're sustained by predictability, honesty, and mutual respect. The excitement may fluctuate. Trust continues to grow. People often underestimate how calming it is to know someone's actions will match their words. Reliability rarely goes viral, but it changes lives. Over time, you begin to realize that emotional intelligence isn't about suppressing feelings. It's about understanding them without allowing them to dominate every decision. Confidence isn't believing you'll never fail. It's trusting that failure won't define you. Resilience isn't avoiding pain. It's developing the capacity to recover, learn, and move forward. And perhaps the most important realization of all is this: the healthiest relationships are not built by finding perfect people. They're built by imperfect people who consistently choose honesty, accountability, empathy, and growth, even when it's difficult. Because in the end, human nature isn't defined by one emotion, one instinct, or one moment. It's defined by the choices people make, repeatedly, when no one is forcing them to choose well. The more carefully you watch people, the more obvious another pattern becomes. Most conflicts don't begin with hostility. They begin with unspoken expectations. Expectation is quiet, invisible, often unconscious. Yet it has enormous influence over how people interpret each other's actions. Someone expects appreciation. Another expects independence. Someone expects frequent communication. Another expects personal space. Neither expectation is written anywhere. Neither person necessarily explains it. Then reality fails to match the expectation. Disappointment appears. The mind immediately starts searching for explanations. They don't care. They've changed. They're disrespecting me. Sometimes those conclusions are accurate. Often they aren't. They're simply the fastest story the brain can construct with limited information. This is why clear communication solves problems that assumptions quietly create. Not because communication guarantees agreement. Because it replaces imagination with information. And information almost always leads to better decisions than imagination alone. There's another tendency that shapes nearly every relationship. People naturally seek patterns. It's one of the brain's greatest strengths. It's also one of its greatest vulnerabilities. When events seem random, the mind connects dots. Sometimes those dots belong together. Sometimes they don't. A delayed reply becomes evidence of fading interest. A distracted conversation becomes proof that affection has disappeared. One disagreement becomes, this relationship is failing. The human brain prefers a complete story to an incomplete one, even if that story is wrong. That's why slowing down can be so powerful. A pause creates space between observation and conclusion. That space is where judgment improves. It's where emotional intelligence grows. It's where impulsive reactions become thoughtful responses. Over time, people who consistently practice this begin to notice something remarkable. Life feels less chaotic. Not because fewer problems appear, because fewer unnecessary problems are created. The ability to separate facts from interpretations becomes one of the most valuable skills a person can develop. Facts are simple. They canceled our plans. Interpretations multiply. They don't respect me. They're hiding something. they've stopped caring. Only one of those statements is directly observable. The others require evidence. Learning that distinction changes conversations, decisions, and relationships. Another overlooked reality is that attention follows emotion. Whatever carries the strongest emotional charge naturally occupies the most mental space. That's why criticism can linger longer than compliments. Why embarrassing moments replay more vividly than ordinary successes. Why unresolved conversations keep returning to awareness. The brain is attempting to solve what it perceives as unfinished. Understanding this doesn't erase emotional reactions. It helps explain them. Once people understand why their attention keeps returning to certain experiences, they become less likely to mistake repetition for importance. Just because a thought appears frequently doesn't mean it's true. It may simply be emotionally unresolved. Recognizing that difference creates freedom. Instead of believing every thought, people begin evaluating it. Instead of reacting immediately, they become observers of their own thinking. That shift is subtle, yet it transforms behavior, because awareness changes choice, and repeated choices shape character. Character, more than charisma, determines whether trust grows or fades over time. Charisma captures attention. Character sustains respect. One creates interest. The other creates confidence. Both have value. Only one consistently survives difficult seasons. When life becomes uncertain, appearances lose influence. Reliability becomes priceless. People remember who remained calm, who stayed honest, who accepted responsibility, who treated others with dignity despite pressure. Those qualities are rarely dramatic. They're quiet, consistent, and difficult to fake for long. That's why authentic growth isn't measured by what people say about themselves. It's measured by what others consistently experience when interacting with them. Words introduce identity. Behavior confirms it. The people who leave the strongest positive impression aren't necessarily the loudest, the most persuasive, or the most charismatic. They're often the ones whose actions repeatedly create a sense of safety, respect, and trust. Those qualities may not command immediate attention, but over time, they become unforgettable. Because while first impressions may open doors, it is consistent character that determines which relationships endure and which quietly fade away. Certainly, here's the next section, continuing the same original, psychology-focused narrative. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that behavior exists in isolation. It doesn't. Every action is connected to a system of beliefs, expectations, incentives, and emotions that usually remain invisible. When someone suddenly becomes distant, the distance itself isn't the entire story. When someone becomes unusually attentive, that isn't the entire story either. Behavior is the surface. Beneath it is perception. Beneath perception is emotion. Beneath emotion are values, experiences, and learned patterns that have been forming for years. That's why judging people based on a single moment is almost always incomplete. A person isn't the worst thing they've done. They're also not the best thing they've done. They're the collection of habits they repeat most consistently. Patterns reveal far more than isolated events. If you want to understand someone's character, don't become fascinated by exceptions. Study their routines. How do they respond when they're frustrated? How do they treat people who have nothing to offer them? What happens when they're wrong? Can they admit it? Do they learn from it? Or do they protect their ego at all costs? Character is easiest to observe when circumstances stop being convenient. Pressure doesn't magically create personality. It often exposes it. This applies to everyone. When life is comfortable, almost anyone can appear patient. When everything is going according to plan, almost anyone can appear generous. The real test arrives when expectations collapse. That's when priorities become visible. It's also when self-awareness becomes invaluable. Many people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to predict everyone else's behavior. They analyze every message, every facial expression, every pause, every word. Meanwhile, they rarely examine the one person whose behavior they have the greatest ability to influence, themselves. This isn't because other people aren't important. It's because your own decisions create the majority of your long-term outcomes. You cannot control another person's honesty. You can decide whether you ignore repeated dishonesty. You cannot control another person's loyalty. You can decide what standards you require before placing your trust in them. You cannot control whether someone appreciates your effort. You can control whether you continue investing where your effort is consistently dismissed. These distinctions seem simple. They're not. The mind naturally gravitates toward problems it cannot solve because they create the illusion of unfinished work. It's much harder to focus on what is actually within your control. That requires responsibility. Responsibility isn't always comfortable, but it is empowering. The moment you stop trying to manage every external variable, your attention becomes available for something more productive, improving your judgment, strengthening your discipline, developing emotional regulation, learning to communicate more clearly, building a life that doesn't depend entirely on someone else's choices. Ironically, people who develop this mindset often become better partners, friends, and leaders. Not because they demand less from others, because they contribute more consistently themselves. Reliability creates trust. Honesty creates clarity. Respect creates safety. These qualities aren't dramatic. They're foundational. And foundations matter most when life becomes unstable. Imagine constructing two buildings. One is designed to look impressive from the street. The other is designed to withstand storms. At first glance, the first building might attract more attention. But when severe weather arrives, appearances stop mattering. Only structure remains. Relationships follow the same principle. Charm may create interest. Integrity determines durability. That's why emotional maturity often feels quieter than emotional excitement. It doesn't need constant reassurance. It doesn't require endless drama to feel alive. It finds strength in consistency. There is a remarkable calm that develops when your actions and your values begin aligning. Decisions become clearer. Boundaries become easier. Regret becomes less frequent because you'll no longer acting against your own principles simply to gain temporary approval. That doesn't mean life becomes effortless. It means your internal conflict begins decreasing. And when internal conflict decreases, external situations become easier to navigate. Not because the world changed, because your response changed. Eventually, you realize one of the most liberating truths in psychology. People will always interpret you through the lens of their own experiences. Some will misunderstand your intentions. Some will underestimate your abilities. Some will project their fears onto your decisions. Trying to control every perception is impossible. Trying to live with integrity is achievable. The difference between those two goals is the difference between constant exhaustion and lasting peace. Once you understand that, you stop chasing universal approval. You begin earning something far more valuable: self-respect. And unlike approval, self-respect cannot be given by someone else. It is built quietly, patiently, and repeatedly, every time your actions remain faithful to the person you are trying to become. There comes a point where the pursuit of certainty begins to cost more than uncertainty itself. At first, that idea sounds backwards. Surely knowing is always better than not knowing. Yet human behavior tells a different story. People spend years waiting for explanations that never arrive. They replay conversations hoping one forgotten sentence will unlock the entire mystery. They imagine that one final answer will finally bring peace. But peace rarely arrives through perfect information. It arrives through acceptance. Acceptance is often misunderstood. Many people believe acceptance means approving of what happened. It doesn't. Acceptance simply means recognizing reality without demanding that it become something else. That distinction matters, because every moment spent arguing with reality is a moment unavailable for building the future. Reality is indifferent to preference. It continues moving whether we're ready or not. The people who adapt most effectively aren't the ones who avoid disappointment. They're the ones who stop negotiating with facts. This happened. It hurt. I wish it had been different. And now I have a decision to make. That final sentence changes everything, because decisions shape direction, not emotions. Emotions influence decisions, but they don't have to control them. Think about how often people postpone important choices until they feel ready. The problem is that readiness is often a byproduct of action rather than a prerequisite for it. Confidence doesn't usually appear before the difficult conversation. It grows because the conversation happened. Discipline doesn't arrive before the early morning routine. It develops because the routine continues despite resistance. Courage isn't a feeling that descends from nowhere. It's a pattern built one uncomfortable decision at a time. This explains why growth feels so ordinary while it's happening. Movies teach us to expect dramatic turning points. Real life usually offers repeated opportunities to make slightly better choices. One healthier response today, another tomorrow, then again next week. Months later, those decisions become a new identity. The transformation feels sudden to everyone else. To the person living it, it was almost invisible. That is the nature of meaningful change. It compounds quietly. Just as unhealthy habits gradually reshape a life, healthy habits do the same. Neither announces itself. Both simply continue accumulating. Eventually, the results become impossible to ignore. There's another misconception worth challenging. Many people believe self-awareness alone is enough. It isn't. Understanding your patterns is valuable. Changing them is where the real work begins. Knowing that you avoid conflict doesn't automatically make you more honest. Knowing that you seek approval doesn't automatically make you independent. Insight opens the door. Practice walks through it. This is why information rarely changes lives by itself. Application does. The world is full of people who know exactly what they should do. Sleep more. Listen better. Exercise consistently. Communicate honestly. Set healthier boundaries. The gap has never been information. The gap is execution. Behavioral change isn't about discovering one magical secret. It's about reducing the distance between what you know and what you repeatedly do. That distance defines character more accurately than intention ever could. Intentions are invisible. Habits are observable. And habits, repeated over time, become reputation. Not just in the eyes of others. In your own eyes. Every promise you keep to yourself strengthens self-trust. Every promise you repeatedly break weakens it. This relationship with yourself quietly influences every other relationship in your life. Because people who trust themselves make decisions differently. They don't become perfect. They become more consistent. They stop chasing every new emotion. They stop allowing temporary discomfort to rewrite long-term priorities. They understand that not every urge deserves action. Not every thought deserves belief. Not every fear deserves obedience. That understanding creates freedom. Freedom isn't doing whatever feels good in the moment. It's having enough self-control to choose what matters most over what feels easiest. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of human behavior. The more disciplined your choices become, the more freedom your future often contains. Discipline creates options. Impulsiveness often removes them. That's true financially, physically, emotionally, professionally. Small choices become large consequences when repeated long enough. The opposite is also true. Small improvements become extraordinary results when given enough time. People often search for breakthrough moments while overlooking breakthrough habits. Yet habits are what carry you when motivation disappears. And motivation always disappears eventually. Nobody feels inspired every day. Nobody feels confident every day. Nobody feels fearless every day. The difference isn't who experiences doubt. It's who continues acting wisely despite it. That quiet persistence has an unusual quality. It rarely receives immediate recognition. But over months and years, it creates something that shortcuts never can. A life built on stability instead of constant reaction. A life where your decisions increasingly reflect your principles instead of your passing moods. And when that happens, something subtle but powerful changes. You stop measuring your progress by how other people respond. You begin measuring it by how closely your daily actions align with the person you're recommitted to becoming. That shift is easy to overlook. Yet it may be one of the most important shifts a person can ever make. Because once your standards come from within, rather than from constant comparison, your direction becomes far more difficult for outside circumstances to disturb. Most people imagine transformation as a single defining event, a breakthrough, a revelation, a moment that divides life into before and after. But if you study human behavior closely, a different picture begins to emerge. Transformation is usually the accumulation of ordinary decisions that nobody celebrates. The decision to pause before reacting. The decision to tell the truth when a convenient excuse would be easier. The decision to keep a promise even when no one would notice if you didn't. These moments rarely feel extraordinary. Yet they quietly redefine identity. Identity isn't built by what you occasionally do. It's built by what you repeatedly reinforce. The brain is constantly asking a simple question. What kind of person am I becoming? It doesn't answer that question by listening to your goals. It answers by observing your behavior. If your actions consistently demonstrate patience, your mind begins to accept patience as part of your identity. If your actions consistently demonstrate discipline, discipline becomes familiar instead of forced. This is why lasting change often starts with behavior rather than belief. People wait to feel confident before acting confidently. They wait to feel disciplined before creating routines. They wait to feel worthy before setting healthy standards. In reality, those feelings often follow the behavior. Action teaches the mind what is possible. Repeated action teaches the mind what is normal. Normal is powerful. Once something becomes your normal, it requires far less effort to maintain. Consider someone learning a new language. The first conversations demand enormous concentration. Every sentence feels deliberate. Months later, words begin appearing without conscious effort. The skill hasn't become easier because the language changed. It became easier because repetition changed the brain. Character develops in much the same way. Integrity becomes easier when practiced consistently. Kindness becomes more natural when chosen repeatedly. Self-control becomes stronger through use. The opposite is equally true. Every repeated shortcut becomes easier. Every repeated excuse becomes more convincing. Every repeated compromise becomes more comfortable. Habits don't ask whether they're healthy. They simply become familiar. That's why awareness is so valuable. It interrupts automatic behavior. It creates a brief space between stimulus and response. Within that space exists choice. And within choice exists the possibility of a different future. Many people underestimate the importance of emotional regulation because it isn't dramatic. Yet nearly every meaningful decision benefits from it. The ability to remain calm during disagreement. The ability to delay immediate gratification for long-term benefit. The ability to separate temporary emotion from permanent values. These skills influence careers, friendships, families, and relationships alike. They're less about suppressing emotion and more about preventing emotion from becoming the only voice in the room. Emotions deserve attention. They don't deserve unquestioned authority. There's wisdom in listening to feelings. There's equal wisdom in examining them. Sometimes fear is warning you about genuine danger. Sometimes it's simply resisting unfamiliar growth. Learning the difference is one of life's ongoing challenges. No formula can answer it perfectly. Experience helps. Reflection helps. Honest feedback helps. Humility helps most of all. Humility is often misunderstood as thinking less of yourself. It's closer to thinking more accurately about yourself. Recognizing strengths without exaggerating them. Recognizing weaknesses without allowing them to define you. Being willing to update your beliefs when better evidence appears. That willingness is surprisingly rare. The ego prefers certainty. Growth prefers curiosity. Curiosity asks better questions. What can I learn here? What assumption am I making? What evidence am I overlooking? Those questions create flexibility. And flexibility is one of the hallmarks of resilient people. Rigid systems break under pressure. Flexible systems adapt. Nature demonstrates this repeatedly. The tree that refuses to bend often snaps during the storm. The one that yields temporarily frequently survives. Psychologically, the principle is similar. Adaptation isn't weakness. It's intelligence responding to changing circumstances. The strongest people aren't always the loudest. They're often the most adaptable. They know when to persist. They know when to adjust. They understand that changing your approach isn't the same as abandoning your values. Values provide direction. Strategies can evolve. This distinction prevents unnecessary suffering. Sometimes people continue fighting battles that ended long ago because they've confused persistence with wisdom. Other times they abandon meaningful goals because they mistaken temporary difficulty for permanent impossibility. Discernment is learning which situation you're facing. No one masters that overnight. It develops through observation, reflection, correction, and the willingness to admit when yesterday's strategy no longer serves today's reality. Over time, these moments accumulate. You become less reactive, more intentional, less concerned with appearances, more concerned with substance, less interested in proving yourself, more interested in improving yourself.